Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. In this first half hour, we're going to spend some time once again looking at one of our Texas legislators. One of the things I appreciate most about this new format, which puts us in the Dallas area, is we get a chance to highlight some of these individuals. In the last couple of weeks, we've had Representative Jeff Leach here. We've had Representative Matt Rinaldi. Last week, we had a number of candidates who will be running in the general election: Angela Paxton, Lisa Luby Ryan, and Candy Noble. We are privileged to bring back to the studio here an individual that I've interviewed in the past on the national program, and that is Representative Matt Shaheen. Represents the Texas House in the 66th District. Individual also that serves today on the Government Transparency and Operation Committees, as well as the International Trade and Intergovernmental Affairs Committees, and is a deacon at Prestonwood Baptist Church. And it is always great to have you in studio with us.
Kerby, thanks for having me.
Again, let's, if we can, talk about some of the things that have changed in the Texas House, because so often, Matt, we talk about when we're looking at the national program, good legislation in the House goes to die in the Senate. That is true in the Congress. It's just the reverse in Texas.
Yep.
You've had some really good legislation in the Senate that goes to die in the House. But I think that's changing because you have probably going to have a new speaker, right?
Yeah, things are changing significantly in the House. So last session, one of the things that happened that was pretty significant was the creation of the Texas Freedom Caucus. And it was a group of a dozen members that, for a variety of different reasons, a lot of our legislation was being blocked in the House. And so we formed a caucus together. And one night we actually took over the House and had actually killed about 200 bills in retaliation for a lot of our pieces of legislation being targeted for the sole reason that we were too conservative. And so that, amongst a couple other things, the fact that the Republican caucus, so 95 members of the House, are going to get together and actually choose who our nominee is, I think those two items actually drove the retirement of the current speaker, Speaker Strauss. And so, yes, we are going to have a new speaker next session, which will start in January of next year. And for all intents and purposes, it looks like we're in a glide path to have a more conservative speaker. So we're excited.
So. And I watched that video with you and Jeff Leach and some of the others talking about that, because it was pretty amazing, because your philosophy was, he's not just going against us, he's going against the people of the state of Texas. That's because exactly you are representing people, and a lot of these individuals we've had on this program not only represent North Texas, but all sorts of other places around the state. And as a result, what you had was good legislation just never even getting out of committee. You know, I'm all for saying, okay, let's bring it out for a vote, and if it's defeated, fine. But when it never even sees the light of day, that was your complaint, was it not?
That's exactly right. In fact, we actually held a press conference right outside the floor of the House. And you mentioned Representative Leach and I think we were the ones that did a lot of the talking during that press conference. And it really was, the way you've articulated is exactly right. So we were essentially not allowed to represent our constituents. Each of us represent about 180,000 citizens in the state of Texas. And more unreasonable, just the fact that the reason being is that our we had just too much of a conservative voting record, which is just ridiculous. In a House, out of 150 members, you got 95 Republicans. So things are going to be different next session. We're excited about it.
Yeah, again, 150 in the House, 31 in the Senate.
150 Psalms and 31 Proverbs, by the way.
It's a good way to remember that as well. Let's talk about one of those pieces of legislation that went to die, and that is, of course, a lot of people heard about Senate Bill 6, but you also, of course, sponsored what was called House Bill 1362.
That's right.
And, Matt, let's, if we can, talk about the fact that some people said that the so-called bathroom bill wasn't pitched right, and maybe your approach made more sense, and that is to talk about local control, because even if you're not really into the whole transgender issue or bathrooms or anything else, telling me what I can do with my own bathroom, that I think attracts people, whether you're liberal or conservative, whether you're Republican or Democrat, right?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. It was a different approach. This had to do really with shifting the dialogue to, it was still around women's privacy and protecting the safety and privacy of women. But it was more along the line, the way I formed that bill, it was more of a dialogue around what's the appropriate role of local government. So should a local school board have a bathroom policy to begin with? Should a city tell businesses what they should do with their restrooms? So what my piece of legislation did, it was a page and a half, Kerby, and it just said if you're a political subdivision in the state of Texas, you can't tell people where to go to the restroom. Because what the problem was is you have more of these radical groups on the left, these gay rights, transgender groups, that what they do, they're like a traveling roadshow. So they go from school board to school board, city to city, saying you've got to do this or there's ramifications. Well, there really is not. And they know they're not going to get anywhere with the legislature. So my approach was just to stop it. So stop telling people where to go to the restroom. And, it was one of the many bills that didn't make it to the House. I think the dialogue will be different, though, next session with a different makeup.
So, again, we're going to be watching some of those as well. Might just mention that you also sit on the board of the Pregnancy Center there for Prestonwood.
Yeah.
And, of course, we've been watching some of the pro-life legislation as well. And any possibility that any of that legislation in the future will be changed, or there might be some additions because of some of the rulings from the courts?
Yeah, there definitely will. We did have some pretty good pro-life victories. Dismemberment abortion was outlawed in the state of Texas. And one of the reasons why that's so important is it really makes the procedure of abortion more real than probably what it is in people's minds. So we literally had a debate on the floor about what happens during that procedure. It's a very difficult and it's a very emotional discussion, but it needs to have. People need to make sure that they're aware of what this procedure actually does. What we were not successful in doing was protecting a special needs child that was unborn. And so that will certainly be pursued aggressively this next session and protect the unborn so that they're not aborted just because they're going to end up being a special needs baby. We need to protect that life.
Good. Let's get to a couple of other issues. I know you've been watching the number of beds that are available for people that have mental health issues.
That's right.
And certainly that is a topic I've mentioned once, but I thought let's get into that for just a minute because you've been kind of studying that and talking about what we can do to make that change.
Mental health is a very challenging topic that we need to address, and both from a local area, from Collin County's perspective, where we've actually created a new mental health entity called LifePath, and that's for the paying public, but a lot of its focus is on the indigent. From a state perspective, yes, we're in the process right now of expanding our psychiatric bed capacity. We're both renovating our current facilities as well as adding capacity. And the renovations is really important. I will tell you, Kerby, some of our institutions are literally over 100 years old.
Yes.
And so you can imagine how the designs were then versus now. So there's a lot of therapeutic, open air, a bunch of different changes, as well as we're going to increase our capacity to address the mental health issues that we have in our state.
Well, again, I've been paying attention to it, one, because my son-in-law is running for an office and has been paying attention to that. And I've got a family member that actually went through LifePath. So, again, I've got some interest in that as well. But when we come back, let's talk about some of the finances. Rainy day fund, property tax reform, variety of other issues. If you'd like to join us, I suspect you're going to just sit back and listen to the conversation with Matt Shaheen. But if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let me mention we also broadcast on the Facebook channel. So, again, if you would like to leave a message or comment there, you can do so. But we're going to spend just a few more minutes with him as well. And this is one of my attempts to kind of highlight some of your legislators you need to know about. And because we have this local Dallas station now, we're going to do this a lot more. Matter of fact, we have another individual coming in next week. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A question Johnny Erickson Tata has been asking over the years is, when is it right to die? That is the title of her book and has recently been updated. She understands this issue for many reasons. One of the most significant is the fact that she has spent more than 50 years in her wheelchair. She was on my radio program recently to talk about the latest edition of her book. She is concerned that society is more and more willing to accept the idea that a person has a right to die. I even talked about the pressure many with disabilities face when there is a subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, comments that imply they have a duty to die. I also asked Johnny to remind our audience that after her accident 50 years ago, she wanted to die. A diving accident as a teenager, she said, left her permanently paralyzed and in deadly despair. She even tried, with no success, to try to break her neck higher so she would die. She understands why so many would want to end their lives, but also believes we can provide hope and comfort to those who are convinced suicide is the only answer. In a related article she wrote for Christianity Today, she talked about speaking to a high school class about euthanasia and suicide. One young man described how demoralized his mother was in caring for his sister, who was developmentally delayed. He said society should do something. Johnny asked him, "How have you helped alleviate the burden?" She went on to explain that his mother wouldn't be so demoralized if he helped. The student immediately realized he might be part of the answer. The point she was making is that suicide and euthanasia are everyone's responsibility. This is especially true in a world where more and more states are willing to legalize euthanasia and put to death people who are discouraged and depressed and ready to die. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Matt Shaheen, and again, he is in the Texas House, District 66. By the way, if you would like to contact him, we do have a link to his website. Just click on his picture there. We also have a link to his Twitter and Facebook, but again, it'll take you to mattshaheen.com. Don't even have to know how to spell his name, although it's pretty easy to spell, because we have a link there. It gives you information about all the issues and all sorts of other topics. There's a video or two to watch, and so all sorts of resources available to you. Simply to go to mattshaheen.com or just go to pointofview.net. You have that link as well. Okay, Matt, let's talk about money.
Let's do it.
State of Texas at least tries to balance its budget. And for somebody who's been talking about a federal government hasn't balanced its budget in decades, it's nice to hear that. But balancing it sometimes requires that you spend money that you should save. And you have what's called the rainy day fund. Talk about that. So I suspect you're going to have to spend out of it now.
Well, there are some challenges that we have next legislative session. We with the Hurricane Harvey, for example. But yeah, as far as what Texas has with respect to a rainy day fund, we have about $11 billion in a fund. That's outside of the $200 billion budget that we put together. And what it is we only budget every 2 years. The Texas legislature only meets every 2 years.
Right.
And so, during a 2-year period, your revenue forecast can be off. So it's really meant if there's a dip, some unexpected shortfall in our revenues, we've got this rainy day fund that we can actually step in. And what happens is a lot of people, when we're budgeting, we're going through the budget process, always want to tap the rainy day fund, and it's a constant battle. And there's strong strict conservatives such as myself and other Freedom Caucus members that are like, look, that thing is for a disaster, a true rainy day fund. And next session, our state got hit by a significant hurricane, as we all know, and its ramifications are going to be felt next legislative session. Just a couple examples. From an infrastructure perspective, first of all, the county and the cities down there did a great job as far as recovery. First responders, we saw the stories of thousands of people going down there and helping people out. I'll tell you what, the
Cajun
Christian
Navy,
the Cajun Navy, but the Christian community came out and just loved on those people and rescued them. But as you can imagine, there's a significant impact. And just think about, for example, just the schools, right? And their property tax levels are not going to be the same as they were. So there's going to be a need for the state to step in and help out. And you know what? That's what that fund is for. This will truly be a rainy day fund. So all the Freedom Caucus members and probably a couple other members caught a lot of flack for not dipping into the rainy day fund, because there's a tendency to make take emotional issues on the floor and try to use that as a way to pull the funds out of the rainy day fund. Man, praise God that we didn't pull those dollars out, because we're going to need them next session.
Well, again, I see how they will actually rate you, whether it's Empower Texas or a variety of other groups, Eagle Forum and the rest. And you guys are always rated real high. But if you open up some of your newspapers in some of the major places, you're rated real low. And for those of us that appreciate the fact that you recognize it's not your dollars, it's our tax dollars and all that, we certainly appreciate that. And you mentioned property tax. That's the other place I wanted to go to. If there's anything I keep hearing, it's property tax reform. Yeah. And I'm all about funding the schools, and we'll get to education in just a minute. But it does seem to me that time has come, maybe time has passed, for us to do something on property tax reform, don't you think?
Woe to the politician that doesn't respond to their constituents on this issue. I literally have people, not only are they brand new to Texas, but they're literally brand new to the United States, that have come to my office, called me, and emailed me about their property taxes. And so this is something that we're going to have to address. We tried to address it last session, and we failed, and which is really significant, because not only are we hearing from our constituents that they want property tax relief and they need property tax relief, but even on the Senate side, they actually traveled the state and had committee hearings throughout the state of Texas and received testimony. But what happens is, when people like me and many other Republicans are trying to get property tax relief crossed, what happens is we have a lot of our cities and our counties and other local subdivisions that we're fighting against. And, Kerby, they prevailed last session. I even did an amendment on the floor, and all it did is it says, look, if a group of Texans, their property tax liability goes up 4%, it just triggers an election. That's all it was. It wasn't a cap on revenues or spending, anything. Just give the citizens the right to vote if their taxes are going too high. That went down. Yeah. And so there's more work to be done.
Well, again, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to highlight some of you right now, because I'm pretty sure you're going to be winning re-election, many of the other ones that we've had on. But we've also had some candidates. We'll have some other candidates here, because changing some of the mindset there would be very helpful. Oh, yeah. It is amazing because, like you say, we have 150 in the House, and you said you have more than 90 that are Republicans. But just because they're Republican doesn't mean they're conservative. And just because they even say they're conservative doesn't mean when it comes down to a vote they're fiscally conservative. Everybody right now is a conservative, right?
Well, I had 40 quote unquote Republicans vote against me.
Yes, there's a good example.
So,
So does that not make my case? Yes. I mentioned education real quickly.
Sure.
That's another issue I know you've been concerned about, and it seems to me that there's some things we can do and should be doing to help education in the state of Texas.
Absolutely. So education is one of the most important things that we do as a state. If you look at our budget, it's our largest line item.
Yes, it is.
So it is over $80 billion that we spend on education, about $64 billion K through 12, and the remaining for the universities. And on top of that, of course, is the tuition, and on top of the K through 12 is the local debt. So, I mean, it's significant dollars. There's a lot of great things that the state of Texas is doing. If you compare us to other states, our graduation rates are consistently in the top 5% in the nation. Those that are economically disadvantaged, the graduation rates are like 4%.
Right.
Hispanic graduation rates are 2%, African American rate on the top 4%. So we're doing some great things. The challenges within the state of Texas, though, is the disparity. So in my district,
the gap, what I call education gap.
Yeah. I mean, we've got you got Frisco, Plano schools that I represent. They are phenomenal schools. Their graduation rates, Kerby, are like 98%. The vast majority of those students are going to go on to college. They're going to be perfectly fine. The challenges that we have is some parts of our state, the graduation rates are low, right? And the challenges are different. And what we need to do is come into the community and agree it's not just a legislative issue, right? If I have a child and as a mom and dad where education is a priority, that child's going to be fine. They're going to have a great future. It's just not all our family structures are like that, and that has an impact. And I can't legislate something to fix that. So in addition to it being a priority for the state of Texas, right, we need to work with our communities, our churches, and lift up those children, invest in those children. But it's not just dollars. I mean, I can look at the Washington, D.C., who has, I think, 60% that they spend more on per child than we do, and their graduation rates are abysmal. So it's going to be a community effort. The state certainly plays a significant role, but we have to have our local nonprofits, our churches step in and invest in those children. The other thing we need to do that I think is very important is school choice.
Yes.
We need to be, as a state, focused on what's best for that child, not what's best for the system or the buildings or those types of things. So if we do have a child that is going to poor performing schools, we need to give those parents the right and the option to do what's best for that child. Or if a child's being bullied, or if they're a special needs child, and maybe the ISD doesn't do a significant job with respect to a special needs child, and maybe there's a neighboring ISD that does a better job, we need to give them that option. So there's a lot more work that we need to do. We're doing quite well, but there's some pockets in the state of Texas we need to address.
Well, again, if nothing else, I think help's on the way, because last week we had two former teachers who were candidates.
That's right.
One that will be in the Senate, one will be in the House, and so maybe they'll be able to help as well. And again, local control, so important, because education in Plano is different than education in San Antonio. Education in El Paso is different than in Tyler, That's right. Recognize some of that as well. Well, Matt, one of the things we've done is have a link to your website, mattshaheen.com, and as people go there, if they want to sign up and get your newsletter, volunteer, contribute, they can do that as well, can't they?
Absolutely. All the information, where I stand on the issues, and some information about me and how God's blessed me with a wonderful wife, Robin, and 3 kids. And then, yes, if you want to help, you can volunteer. We're definitely going to need your help coming September, October timeframe as we run for re-election in November. And if as many people that can engage with our campaign, it would be a blessing. We'll have fun, too, by the way.
I know you will. And you got a television ad. It's about 30 seconds, so I'm going to give everybody an assignment. That is to watch it. Only going to take 30 seconds out of your time. And then there's an arrow, and, of course, you're an IT guy. You know all about this. But a lot of people don't realize if they click on that, they can share that, and they could put it on their Facebook page or on their Twitter account, or they could send it to someone, and they could then give you a little more visibility than those that just happen to be listening
and
today.
I'd be grateful for that. You know, social media, it seems like every campaign cycle is more and more of a prominent role in our campaign. So, the more people that share, and I do the vast majority of my communications now through social media, either Facebook or Twitter, that people can follow.
Well, again, 66th District, and again, if you are in that district, you need to sign up. But even if so, you need to follow what Matt Shaheen's doing. So thanks for being in the studio
Kerby,
with us today.
thank you.
We will do it again. I'm going to take a break. We've got some more to talk about, and then we'll be talking about evangelism in the next hour with Preston Condra. All that coming up right after this.
Does point of view make any difference? I think Dr. Eric Walsh would say it does. Dr. Walsh was fired from his job as District Health Director for the state of Georgia, not because of anything he did or failed to do on the job, but because of sermons he preached in his local church. What does that have to do with point of view? Jeremy Dyes of First Liberty represented Dr. Walsh, and in February, the state of Georgia paid a large settlement for their religious discrimination. And Jeremy Dyes became an attorney specializing in defending religious liberty greatly because of what he learned listening to Point of View Radio as a child. That is the kind of difference you make when you support the Truth Team, but we can't make that difference without your help. Become a partner today in this important mission of speaking truth in love. Join the Truth Team at pointofview.net/team. Choose your giving level, stretch a bit, and please do it today. Or call 800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/team. Or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation. If you would like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Lots to talk about here, but I thought for just a minute I'd talk about Chick-fil-A. I wasn't planning to, but I have a commentary coming out next week on some of the comments that appeared in New Yorker magazine about Chick-fil-A, and so I thought, well, that was enough. But then a good friend of ours who's been on the program with us many times, Robert Knight, his column today that's in the Washington Times is entitled In Praise of Chick-fil-A's Infiltration. So for just a minute or two, I thought we might talk about that. Now, he starts out by actually putting some of the lyrics from comedian Tim Hawkins. Now, if you're familiar with Tim Hawkins, not only is he a stand-up comedian and an outstanding one at that, but oftentimes, of course, he plays his guitar, and this one is, this song that he did on Chick-fil-A, I could eat there 7 times a day, where the people laugh and children play, oh, I'm in love with Chick-fil-A, suddenly I want waffle fries in front of me. And, of course, he sort of complains in a joking sort of way that Chick-fil-A is closed on Sundays. So is Hobby Lobby and a variety of others. But anyway, he goes on to then, that is Robert Knight goes on to say that many people in Manhattan apparently feel the same way as Tim Hawkins. The handful of Chick-fil-A stores in the Big Apple attract long lines. One of them reportedly sells a chicken sandwich every 6 seconds. Which is amazing. I'm going to get more into the huge store that has just been placed there in New York. But nevertheless, Robert Knight goes on to say this outpouring of foul fandom comes even though the president of the Atlanta-based fast food chain committed the ultimate sin 6 years ago. That was in 2012 in the eyes of the New York intelligentsia. Because, and he's talking about Dan Cathy, although he doesn't mention his name here. Dan Cathy said he thought marriage was the union of a man and a woman. He said, quote, the way God created it. And then Robert Knight goes on to say, the way that Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton described it right into 2012 after they embraced the Roman Emperor Nero's version. He says, we know the ruling elite in New York are unsettled by Chick-fil-A's enormous success because the New Yorker magazine, their flagship of cool, has done a hit job. Keep in mind, this is not your father's New Yorker, which was chock full of compelling reading and cartoons you'd put on your refrigerator. As you may have already heard about the article by the individual that ran on April 13th, and the title of the article was Chick-fil-A's Creepy Infiltration of New York City. And Robert Knight goes on to say it's urban arrogance and contempt for Christianity ticked off not a few people, which was obviously intentional. He said to Juice readership, the New Yorker tweeted, Chick-fil-A's arrival in New York City feels like an infiltration, in no smart because of its pervasive Christian traditionalism. He says, somehow I doubt he will do a similar piece fretting about the infiltration of hundreds of Muslim immigrants who run food carts and newly opened stores in New York featuring halal food. You're probably going to have to wait a long time before anything like that ever happens. And he said he read this piece that appeared in the New Yorker after a friend sent me a tweet about it from the prolific blogger Iowa Hawk. And he put it this way, once again, if you're frightened by what Trump says about immigrants, you should see what the New Yorker says about people from their own country. I love that as well. And he says the author complains that the 3-story newest Chick-fil-A store, which, by the way, he doesn't say here, but it's 12,000 square feet. Oh, it is the largest Chick-fil-A store in the world, as far as I understand, from what I've been able to read. But nevertheless, overemphasizes community as a value and suggests this is the ulterior motive. The restaurant's corporate purpose still begins with the words to glorify God, and that proselytism thrums below the surface of the Fulton Street restaurant, which has the homespun ambience of a megachurch. He's, again, quoting from our person that wrote that critical article in the New Yorker. And so the argument here is that he's suggesting that these famous Chick-fil-A cows and their deliberate misspelling, eat more chicken ads, he says, again, the author says, it's impossible to overstate the role of the cows. If restaurant is a megachurch, the cows are its ultimate evangelist. This is a piece that's so over the top, it's almost hard to quote from it without you saying, nah, he didn't really say that, did he? Yeah, he really did. And again, he talks about the cow campaign, saying that that's morbid because it's asking Americans to fall in love with an ad in which one farm animal begs you to kill another in its place. And I love Robert Knight at this point. He says, I don't think many people go into that deep into the liberal worry pit. If they did, they would have to run Charlie the tuna out of supermarkets for urging customers to eat Charlie's own canned finny friends. You gotta love Robert Knight on this. And so it goes on to say that Chick-fil-A's infiltration of the Big Apple is only the tip of the iceberg. The firm is fast expanding and is expected to become the third largest fast food chain in the nation, behind only McDonald's and Starbucks by 2020. Subway has the most stores right now, but that is just the projection. And again, he gives a little bit of the history of Chick-fil-A, if you're not familiar with it. Actually founded in 1967 by Truett Cathy, who died at the age of 93 just a couple of years ago. Chick-fil-A has 2,300 restaurants in 47 states, has $9 billion in sales, at least in 2017, operates only 6 days a week, closed on Sundays, but that hasn't hurt the chain. And its success has come in the face of threatened boycotts by several big city mayors, including New York's Bill de Blasio, Boston's Thomas Marino, and his successor Martin Walsh, plus Chicago's Rahm Emanuel. The Godfather proclaimed in 2012 that Chick-fil-A's values are not Chicago's values. He said, I'm not going to let that big fat softball fly by. To get around the big city chicken curtain, Chick-fil-A has been opening restaurants in the suburbs. But even in New York City, resistance has ebbed, and the chain is spreading its good cheer and Christian values into the heart of Gotham. Who knows, maybe even New York cabbies will someday be thanking passengers by saying, my pleasure, in a Southern accent. And in the words of Tim Hawkins, Chick-fil-A, you set me free. So anyway, just a piece that came out today by Robert Knight, who's been on the program with us before. And in my commentary that's coming out next week, I talked about the fact that, of course, not everybody has been thrilled with Chick-fil-A, but nevertheless, this now is one of the largest, if not the largest, restaurant for Chick-fil-A, 12,000 square feet. And, of course, the mayor, as we pointed out, when the first standalone restaurant came, they were urging a boycott then. But it's certainly not going to cause Chick-fil-A to fade into the sunset. It will, as we pointed out, become the third largest fast food chain behind McDonald's and Starbucks. Unless you don't consider Starbucks a fast food chain, then it would be number two, however you want to define that. And again, $9 billion worth of revenue. But again, the error, if you will, the transgression or the sin, depending on what word you want to use for Chick-fil-A, is the fact that back in 2012, Dan Cathy actually supported traditional marriage and had some things to say about the LGBT issues. And so as a result, you get some pushback from secularists that don't like Christian businesses and companies, and you get a pushback from the gay rights activists who don't like companies that don't support their homosexual agenda. But again, the one question that I address in my commentary that comes out next week is, why Chick-fil-A? I mean, it isn't all that political. I mean, there are many other Christian organizations that have the same values, the same views as Chick-fil-A, and they're much more political. They lobby for legislation. They support various candidates. Chick-fil-A really does not do that at all. And yet Chick-fil-A almost always seems to have a target on its back. And I guess maybe part of the reason gets back to these ads that in New York now, because it's so successful, there are a lot of places you go and you see billboards or ads in the subways about the cows, and the ads and the billboards. Maybe that makes everybody feel like it's an infiltration. But my solution is simply this. I would want to remind our friends in New York, especially our New Yorkers in New York City, that, you know, many of us in the rest of the country are bombarded by ads about products and services by companies with values which are oftentimes very hostile to Christian beliefs. But you know what? We've sort of adopted a philosophy of live and let live. You know, you can decide whether you want to buy that computer or not, whether you want to buy that service or not, when you want to go into that store or not. But we just sort of have a live and let live philosophy. I think it's about time for New Yorkers who say that they're open-minded and tolerant. Maybe they need to adopt that live and let live philosophy as well. And so if nothing else, that's just a little bit of a flap that developed over the last few weeks over Chick-fil-A. My commentary comes out next week. Of course, if you haven't signed up to receive it, you can get it in your inbox. And so there are just all sorts of ways in which we can let you know about some of these important issues. And, of course, don't forget that today we've posted a number of articles about some of the conversation that we've had here as well. In just a few minutes, we're going to be getting into the subject of evangelism, and so we're going to be talking about a couple of books, and we've posted information about those by which we are saved, and I have some good news, and so those resources are on the website, and you can certainly benefit from them as well. If you'd like to know more about any of our guests, including our guest that we had this hour, Matt Shaheen, it's all available at the website pointofview.net. Well, I talked about a commentary by Robert Knight. When I come back, I thought I'd very quickly mention a commentary by our good friend Jerry Newcomb, who'll be on soon. We'll talk about that right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Father Joseph LaFleur served the Army Air Corps as chaplain during World War II. In 1941, LaFleur dashed about Clark Field in the Philippines amidst bombs and flying shrapnel, pulling wounded soldiers to safety. For such bravery, the Army Air Corps awarded Chaplain LaFleur the Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and Distinguished Service Cross. Later, while imprisoned by the Japanese for 3 years, he never stopped his ministry of care. He worked to meet the physical needs of his fellow prisoners, often bartering with guards for food. Once he confronted a fellow prisoner about stealing rations from other prisoners, even landing 2 holy punches to pacify the unruly and unrepentant soldier. In 1944, a U.S. submarine torpedoed LaFleur's prisoner transport ship. Rather than abandon ship or seek to escape Japanese gunfire and grenades lobbed in his direction, the chaplain worked to calm his men and to help them find an escape passage. Chaplain LaFleur died as he lived, in faithful service to his fellow man. Motivated by faith to care for their fellow man, chaplains in our nation's service routinely steady our servicemen and women before, during, and after battle. Military chaplains navigate the evils of war to bring good to our military. We honor Chaplain LaFleur and all chaplains for their dedication to the souls of our armed forces. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. Let me just mention in the second hour, we're going to get into the subject of evangelism. A couple of really good books. First of all, By Which We Are Saved, Sharing the Gospel with Confidence, as well as I Have Some Good News, The Gospel Objections and Answers, and Preston Condra will be in studio with us, so we're going to spend some time talking with him. In the third hour, got about a half an hour interview that we're going to be doing with Penny Nance of Concerned Women for America. Those of you on the local station might have to listen to it online or go to our Facebook Live page. We'll be talking about the decision that the president made, which I agree with, to sign the anti-sex trafficking bill and a couple of other very important issues. Matter of fact, last time we had Penny Nance on, we also talked about the whole issue of sexual harassment and the Me Too movement and a number of other things. So certainly we'll try to cover many different topics with with her. And so, again, that gives you an overview for the next couple of hours that we'll be broadcasting today. And I thought just before we wind down the first hour here, I might read from a piece by Jerry Newcomb. Jerry Newcomb will be with us on Thursday, but again, that will be at a different hour. And just in case you didn't have a chance to hear that interview that we'll do this coming Thursday, I thought I'd mention it in this hour today. And he calls it The Confessions of a Christian Constitutionalist. Now, what had happened is that he wrote a piece. It came out a while back. I think it was this one was in Front Page. I don't know if that one was in Front Page. I think it was in Human Events, but wherever it was, Washington, May have been WorldNet Daily. I can't remember exactly where it was. But nevertheless, when his column came out on fake news, someone sent an email accusing him of propagating fake news by saying the Bible had anything to do with the founding of America. And then the email stated the common charge, he says, that the Constitution was the product of men of the Enlightenment with Masonic influence. And he said, unfortunately, this reader, like so many others, fails to understand the historic truth that the Bible played a unique role in helping to create the U.S. Constitution. Now, this shouldn't be very controversial, but you go onto a college campus, and it's very controversial. And yet, if I am given just a little bit of time without people constantly interrupting to just even give a presentation, which is based upon a book in large part that Jerry Newcomb and another individual wrote, although I've added a lot over those years since I went to Georgetown and got a second master's degree in American political theory at Georgetown. We can point out very quickly the influence of the Bible and Christians in the founding of this country and of the framing of our Constitution. That being said, there's always a need to educate, and that's why I thought I'd just take a few minutes, and very few minutes here, to pick out just a few of the things Jerry Newcomb mentions in his piece. And again, he'll be with us on Thursday, but it's I think the later hour, so you may not have a chance to hear it, so that's why we're covering it right now. He says, first of all, the biblical concepts of covenants gave rise to the Puritan type of covenants. The Pilgrims began the process with the Mayflower Compact. You may remember, and we've talked about this on the program before, that when the Mayflower docked, it was not where it had a charter. So they decided to write up a new charter, which was the Mayflower Compact, which was done, as it says, in the name of God, in which they declared their purpose was for the glory of God and for the advancement of the Christian faith, and also that they were doing this to form a civil body politic. One of my major professors at Georgetown University, who, to put it charitably, could not sign the doctrinal statement of your church, was much more a secular person, nevertheless had to admit that really the foundation, if you will, the format for our Constitution went all the way back to the Mayflower Compact in 1620. So then we go back to Jerry Newcomb's column. He says after this compact, there were about 100 or so Bible-inspired covenants, frames of government, and articles in America, all leading the way to the U.S. Constitution in 1787. If you look, for example, at the Puritans, we can talk about the Pilgrims a minute ago, but then the Puritans, they actually had these covenants, and they actually established all sorts of laws and rules, and many of them ended up even in our U.S. Constitution. Here's a good example that Jerry Newcomb uses. He says one of the Puritan documents was the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut in 1639, which says they started their colony for the liberty and purity of the gospel of our Lord Jesus. The Fundamental Orders were the first complete constitution written on American soil and is believed by historians to have impacted the U.S. Constitution. That is why Connecticut calls itself the Constitution State. Well, then again, the U.S. Constitution itself was completed in the year of our Lord, meaning Jesus. It was signed in the 12th year of independence. The Constitution was predicated on the Declaration of Independence, which is our national birth certificate, and mentions God 4 times. If you haven't read the Declaration of Independence recently, go back and just read it. You'll recognize that God is mentioned either explicitly or implicitly 4 times in the Declaration of Independence. So then Jerry Newcomb asks a good question. Was all this a product of men of the Enlightenment? And he says the late Michael Novak, who I had a chance to know when I was at Georgetown and in Washington, D.C., of the American Enterprise Institute, made a great point about the Enlightenment. It was not monolithic. There were 2 types of Enlightenment thinkers. Those were those that were solidly in the Judeo-Christian tradition. That would be Montesquieu, John Locke, William Blackstone. And then there were those that were not, like David Hume and Voltaire. Well, it turns out that individuals, including my major professor at Georgetown, actually went back and looked at the various quotes from those individuals of the founding era. And now, as Jerry Newcomb points out, the most quoted document was the Bible, 33% of the time. Then in order, Montesquieu, Blackstone, and Locke, in that order. And so then he goes through and gives you quotes from Baron Montesquieu about the spirit of laws. He gives you quotes from William Blackstone, who was quoted oftentimes in the Supreme Court, even to this day is still quoted. John Locke, who penned that the Bible is one of the greatest blessings bestowed by God on the children of men. And so he goes through a variety of individuals who were very instrumental in the founding of this country, at least intellectually. And then he concludes by giving us some quotes from a few others. George Washington, his circular to the states, said that unless we learn to imitate Jesus, the divine author of our blessed religion, we will not be a happy nation. John Adams refers to the fact that he calls for a decent respect for Christianity among the best recommendations of public service. So that's the first president. That's the second president. Okay, third president, Thomas Jefferson. Okay, he's supposed to be real secular, right? Thomas Jefferson said that Jesus is the reason we have religious freedom. He said to force people to believe in religious views that they don't share are a departure from him, the holy author of our religion. Goes on then to quote from James Madison, who's oftentimes referred to as the architect of the Constitution, and wrote that our obligations to God come before those to the state. Quote, before any man can be considered as a member of civil society, he must be considered as a subject of the governor of the universe. And so just a couple of pieces from Jerry Newcomb. We'll get into it a little bit more with him on Thursday. But again, since that will be in an hour that some of you might not have a chance to hear, I will certainly commend to you his piece. We'll post his column on Thursday. And if nothing else, just a little bit of a history lesson to remind us that if you want to look at the founders of this country, without a doubt, so many of them were Christian and Christian-based. If you then look at the framers of the Constitution, primarily you're looking at Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and most importantly, James Madison. Or if you look at our first presidents, you can see that certainly Christianity was a lot more important than that one person who wrote to him accusing him of fake news by saying that the Bible had anything to do with the founding of America. We certainly do recognize that Christian values were very important in the founding of this republic. The sad reality is some people reject that, and even more so, have doubts about whether Christianity is important in the maintenance of this republic, but they certainly are important. Well, we're going to talk about the Bible and evangelism in this next hour, and if you would like to join us, we will open up the phones to get your comments or questions about sharing your faith with others. All that coming up right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. This hour we're going to spend some time talking about evangelism, how to do it, how to answer some of the objections and questions. And we are featuring two books written by an individual that we've had on the program before. In studio with us today, Preston Condra. He is an ordained Southern Baptist minister, graduate of Oklahoma Baptist University and Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. You may remember him as an individual that has been on the staff of Watchman Fellowship, of course, as the founder of Sufficient Word Publishing. We have lots of information about him on our website. And Condra, thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. It's good to be here. Thanks for having me on.
I might mention that you and your wife, Kelly, have written these books, and we were originally going to have both of you in, but I think you and I can probably do a pretty good job with this. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. You and I first met at a Worldview weekend, and you first met your wife at a Worldview weekend. So
I sure did.
That's kind of a fun story.
I sure did. It is. She was there to actually thank Ken Ham for leading her, Ken Ham of Answers in Genesis, for leading her to the Lord. And heaven, behold, she met her husband, her husband to be as well. So that was quite a thing. So, and you happened to be at the Worldview weekend too, right speaking.
Yeah,
so
those Worldview weekends put on by Brandon House. Some of them are still going on, but those were almost every weekend if you weren't careful. And there was a time when most every weekend you were out traveling speaking, right? Was that right?
Yeah, with Watchmen, I was probably preaching, I don't know, maybe around 40 Sundays a year plus youth camps in the summer. So when Kelly and I met, we had to, of course, she lived in Minnesota, I lived in Dallas, and we had to schedule our dating months in advance. So it was an interesting time for sure.
And so you met halfway. You're in Arkansas. Not really halfway, but anyway, it's kind of funny.
We moved to Arkansas,
which is the location of Sufficient Word Publishing. But talk about Watchman Fellowship for a minute, because there's a sense in which this links very much. Because when we talk about sharing the gospel, some of the objections and some of the questions are the ones that you get from people that might be in the New Age, they might be in a false religion or something like that. And so that's one of the things that you, for many years, was involved with in terms of just doing kind of research into some of these new religious movements.
Yeah, at Watchman, we did a lot, especially in the area of addressing cults. Now, we decided to use the term counterfeit, because that, I think, expressed in the culture, because when you think of cult, I mean, I think you automatically go to David Koresh or some of these more dangerous groups. But some of these questions are asked by some in cults, and these are just normal everyday questions, really, Kerby. I mean, I've had some of them, like in regard to Jesus being the only way of salvation. Some of these others are asked to us by New Agers or some others, skeptics, whatnot. In that regard, we are answering objections, so there is a relation to apologetics.
Yes, and as a matter of fact, back to my commentaries, if I'd thought this through, the commentary that aired last week, I should have had to air today, because it's all about some of the facts and figures. And so whether you're talking about these counterfeit religions, or whether you're even talking about Orthodox, born-again Christians, just because you're saved in your heart doesn't mean you're saved in your head. And we find a lot of individuals are accepting non-biblical views about God and about salvation and about evangelism. Fair?
Oh, absolutely. Your numbers were really good last week. I think you cited, I think it was Barna,
George Barna,
and Probe together. I
Probe
think
Ministries has done a lot of work on that.
Yeah, your research said 64% of evangelicals believe that everyone will go to heaven someday. That's 2/3, 2 out of 3. I'm a Southern Baptist minister. That's a shocking thought.
And sadly, the numbers are only slightly lower in the Southern Baptist churches.
They really are. And there's another number I'll get to in just a minute that really concerns me and is some of our motivation in publishing these books. But also, your numbers were 48% of evangelicals believe in a pluralistic view of salvation. So plural, by that we mean that there are multiple ways of salvation. Basically, any way is valid.
Yeah. Why do mission work if indeed somebody can be saved without hearing the gospel?
Right. I mean, I think it's always illustrated with the illustration "all roads lead to heaven," which really is not even a good illustration because all roads don't ever lead to the same place, right?
That's a good point.
But that's usually how it's illustrated.
Well, again, we're talking about these books. First of all, I have some good news: the Gospel, Objections, and Answers, and the one I think we'll start with, By Which We Are Saved, Sharing the Gospel with Confidence. But let's talk about that for just a minute, because I think I know what your statistic is going to be. How many born-again Christians actually in the last year or so have shared their faith? What have we found out?
Right. I think Barna said 23% in that study, but then when you drill down a little bit into the study, I think they actually concluded there was 10% who shared their faith actually shared a biblical message,
right?
Which is what a major concern we have. But Southern Baptist numbers, let me get to that for just a minute too. Lifeway, I think it was last year, published their baptism numbers. Now, for the audience, baptism is not a measure of, we don't relate that to salvation. It has nothing to do with the person being saved. It is something that happens. It's a step of obedience after salvation, is how Southern Baptists say it, believer's baptism.
Sure.
Lifeway said in 2009, from 2009 to 2016, we baptized 70,000 fewer people. So we use baptisms. We can also track how many people are converted, how many people become believers. So from 2009 to 2016, by the numbers we have 70,000 fewer baptisms. I live in Springdale, Arkansas. That is the population of Springdale, Arkansas. And so I just think, wow, this really concerns me. Because why? Well, the Southern Baptist Convention is the largest evangelical denomination in the world. And if we're declining like that, then, I mean, we're not reaching people with the gospel. And I want to do, Kelly and I, my wife, we want to do something to help take the needle back the other way on evangelism. And I'm convinced this evangelism happens person to person, one-on-one. And if we can help believers to do, and churches, we want to help churches too. These books are a great help for churches as well as individual believers.
And again, each one of the books, and we have information about those. And as a matter of fact, for those of you watching online, I'll hold up a sample of the books. Here's one of them right here, about 160, 70 pages for each one of these books. And these are just some great resources that, first of all, I think individuals would want to study just to maybe get some, if you will, spiritual and intellectual ammunition. And then, of course, you have one just on some of the objections and answers, which are the kind of things, as I was even looking at here, that I've run into when I sometimes, or even talking to believers, but certainly the kinds of questions I've run into over the years when I talk to non-believers. And so you're doing both evangelism and apologetics in very nicely written books that I think could be used in a small group study, an individual study. I hope some pastors would preach it from the pulpit.
Yeah,
so we're going to come back and get into this in a little more detail. Both of these books we have information about them on the website, and of course people can go to Sufficient Word Publishing. We have a link there as well to get these books. But when we come back, I want to talk about, well, what is the gospel? Why aren't people sharing the gospel? And maybe a few of the objections that you will run into if you're doing evangelism. I know our own church does Evangelism Explosion. Whatever program you use, that's great. I just want you to do one, and we'll talk more about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
I A question Johnny Erickson Tata has been asking over the years is, when is it right to die? That is the title of her book and has recently been updated. She understands this issue for many reasons. One of the most significant is the fact that she has spent more than 50 years in her wheelchair. She was on my radio program recently to talk about the latest edition of her book. She is concerned that society is more and more willing to accept the idea that a person has a right to die. I even talked about the pressure many with disabilities face when there is a subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, comments that imply they have a duty to die. I also asked Johnny to remind our audience that after her accident 50 years ago, she wanted to die. A diving accident as a teenager, she said, left her permanently paralyzed and in deadly despair. She even tried, with no success, to try to break her neck higher so she would die. She understands why so many would want to end their lives, but also believes we can provide hope and comfort to those who are convinced suicide is the only answer. In a related article she wrote for Christianity Today, she talked about speaking to a high school class about euthanasia and suicide. One young man described how demoralized his mother was in caring for his sister, who was developmentally delayed. He said society should do something. Johnny asked him, how have you helped alleviate the burden? She went on to explain that his mother wouldn't be so demoralized if he helped. The student immediately realized he might be part of the answer. The point she was making is that suicide and euthanasia are everyone's responsibility. This is especially true in a world where more and more states are willing to legalize euthanasia and put to death people who are discouraged and depressed and ready to die. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we're talking about the subject of evangelism, and if you would like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. We have two books. For just a minute, let's see if we can explain how people could use those. We do have a link to sufficientwordpublishing.com, and when you go there, you can get all sorts of things. You have a miniature version of the books in track form. You have the books. You have speaking. Mm-hmm. We'll talk more about all that in just a minute. But right now, Preston, a lot of people are saying, okay, you've already convinced me. We know most of the people in my church, most of the people in my Sunday school class, most of the people in my small group are not sharing their faith. Mm-hmm. I'd like to maybe give them some motivation and some education. This would be great. How do I use these two books? It seems to me that this big book, By Which We Are Saved, is really the book that I would use if I were teaching a Sunday school class. Yep. Matter of fact, maybe I'll use it even in my own Sunday school class at Prestonwood. And this one is broken down into a number of chapters. So talk about how a small group leader, a Bible fellowship leader, even a pastor might use that.
We're seeing churches use it in a variety of ways. One of the ways that excites me most is something you and I talked about during the break was pastors preaching at Sunday morning.
Yes.
Some of them are doing a By Which We Were Saved Sunday morning sermon series. They'll have me come in and preach to kick it off, and I do kind of an introductory sermon on 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 4. Mm-hmm. I just go through phrase by phrase what Paul's saying there. And then they do a study on the elements of the gospel in their sermon series, who he is, what he did, why I need it, or I find it. And some tie that together with a group study. Some of the churches are. So in the group study, I just go through chapter by chapter, and we've put the Bible verses right in the pages of the book, not just cross-referenced, with concise explanations and answers to the objections that are in there. And so if I was him, I'd go through the first chapter, explains the gospel, each piece of it thoroughly. I would take a couple of weeks at least on that, because this is really what we're wanting the average church member, average Sunday school goer, average believer to grab a hold of. Because I think if they can have a grasp on the gospel, they can talk to the people they know.
Yes.
We've got some helps in there that are going to be helpful to them in chapter 2, and that are important to the conversation. But we really need them to grasp the gospel. And this is where, Kerby, I think some of the problem is amongst believers is we're not clear on the gospel. We use shortcuts and explain it, which I'm sure we can talk about that some.
Yeah, sure.
But we want believers to really grasp this. If they can grasp each concept here, and 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 4 tells us that. It's real simple. Paul says this is the gospel. Well, let me say that again. This is the gospel. That word is used quite a bit.
Right.
It's so much so it's almost meaningless.
Yes.
But it's not in the Scripture.
Yeah.
1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, this is the gospel which I preached to you. So this is the gospel that Paul preached.
Right.
And
1 Corinthians was written relatively early in the church life.
That's right.
And may have even been a doxology, if you will, before it was even written by Paul, don't you think?
Yeah, it could have been.
Yeah.
And we even know the title of the gospel, which was in Romans chapter 1, verse 16, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ.
Right.
For it's the power of God unto salvation to everyone who believes. So we know it's the gospel of Christ he's talking about here. And he doesn't just tell us to proclaim the gospel and that this is the gospel he preached. He actually tells us what it is.
What it is.
You skip down to verses 3 and 4 after he has said this is the gospel by which you are saved. So it's a saving message too. That word gospel is message. It's good news. So it's a saving message. It's so powerful. All you have to do is believe it and you're saved. What is the contents of it though? Because faith always has an object. What are we asking people to believe? What's Paul asking us to believe? And he says right there in verses 3 and 4, in fact, if you want to minimize sharing your faith right here, this half of verse 3 and verse 4, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and he was buried. That proved he died. And on the third day, he rose from the dead according to the Scriptures. So each element's there. Who he is, what he did, why I need it, where I find it. All those elements are there, and how I get it.
Yeah.
So,
and again, those 5 points are really important, and so much so that you have 8 chapters, and 5 of the chapters are the ones we just talked about. Chapter 3 is who he is. I think most people have that understanding, but we can come back to it. What he did, which I appreciate there, because you have a section there on the death, burial, resurrection, but you also not only give us 1 Corinthians 15, but you also quote like from the Quran to help us understand that a lot of people say, well, they're probably saved too. Well, no, if you really believe what Muslims believe, if you really believe what's in the Quran, they don't. Then you talk about, what other religions believe and other false groups, because you've been an expert on counterfeit religion. So who he is, what he did, why I need it, which pretty obvious, again, I would hope for most people, how to get it and where to find it. But those are 5 of the 8 chapters. So I think, if nothing else, it's just a good illustration, Preston, of the fact that you're saying, when you get this down, all the rest is, extra, because once you have that down, that gives you a guideline or a plumb line or a ruler, whatever metaphor you want to use to measure any other false gospel, too, right?
That's exactly right, because Paul does say in 2 Corinthians 11, which we preach at Watchman a lot, that they'll come with preaching another Jesus, another gospel.
Yes.
And so, this is crucial for the believer in sharing their faith it's the first obvious step is knowing the gospel. This is what you believe to become a believer.
Right.
This is what we need to know inside and out, sharing with. And by the way, I'm not saying you need to be an expert. This is why we've written the book. This is a tool you can use. You don't have to be an expert. You don't have to go get a master's degree in theology. So we've done the work right here. It's easy to use. It's concise. It's short. And we've covered everything, I think. As far as objections go, we've really got them all in there.
Part of the problem, too, is that when people come to know the Lord and when they become a Christian, they don't know all the theology behind it. Matter of fact, tomorrow in my first hour for the local radio station, we're going to have Child Evangelism Fellowship. Any young child that accepts, childlike faith, but they don't really understand everything about justification by faith, sanctification, the death, the cross, all that. But the problem is, Preston, sometimes is we, become Christians with a limited amount of knowledge, but we know we need to accept Jesus Christ as our Savior, but we don't learn anymore. So then we pass on our ignorance about the gospel, and as a result, then we are surprised that our evangelistic opportunities don't really succeed sometimes.
You're right, and it's interesting you bring up the children. When we volunteered at a children's home in Northwest Arkansas, and we had early copies of the book before it was distributed, and so we were reading it after we put the kids to bed, Kelly and I, and one of the little boys, a 10-year-old boy, came out and said, "Your name's on that book. Is that your book?" He was, he thought that was something. And we said, "Yeah, it is." "Well, can I read it?" And we said, "Okay." We didn't know what to expect from a 10 or 11-year-old boy. Well, we came back, he came back out with it and said, "My friends are asking these questions. We're talking about this on the bus the other day." And we said, "Really?" And well, here, take the book. And he came back and said we talked to him a couple weeks later. He was sharing these things with the people on his bus. So it's simple enough. My point, it's simple enough that a 10 or 11-year-old can even use it.
Yeah, I would think so. And it's very well written, by the way. Again, this would be the book that I would recommend for individuals in a Sunday school class. But let me finish the rest point before we take our break. This is a book that you really could give to your non-Christian friends. And so in some respects, if I do this, and I might even do it in my own Sunday school class, we will go through this, and I'll make sure anybody in a small group has this book. And then when they finish this book, I would give them this book, not to read, but to hand to somebody that is not saved, because some of the material is in both of those in terms of those objections. And so when we come back from the break, let's talk about some of those objections, because that's another issue. Sometimes we don't share our faith because we don't feel like we're prepared. Yet the first time I shared my faith, I had just become a Christian. And when you become a Christian in Berkeley, California, let me tell you, you don't know a whole lot about theology, okay? But I did the best I could with what I had, because I had read C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity and John Stott's Basic Christianity, so I knew enough to be dangerous. But sometimes we don't know as much. But then the other thing is, we're afraid if we're going to be rejected, or they're going to ask a question I don't have an answer. And my argument is, even if you don't have an answer, the good news is we have posted so many articles, and so many other Watchman Fellowship have as well, and all sorts of ministries have. You can say, I don't have an answer, but I'll tell you what, let me write this down. I'll do a Google search, and maybe right now or tomorrow when we get together, I'll give you an answer, because there are people that have been thinking about this for decades who have good academic credentials and good theological credentials that can probably answer that question. But let's see if we can get into a few of those objections, because that's another part and just a really excellent feature of the book. Again, we have two books, one, By Which We Are Saved, Sharing the Gospel with Confidence. Preston Condra and Kelly Condra are the authors of that. But then another book I just mentioned, I Have Some Good News, The Gospel, Objections, and Answers. And we have all of that at the website, sufficientwordpublishing.com. We'll talk about that website right after these important messages.
Point of View turned life right side up for Emily's children. Emily listens in Illinois. She and her husband blissfully sent their children off each day to what she called our small, quaint public school, until Point of View led them to watch the documentary Indoctrination. She said, "We came to realize the need for us to educate our children at home. We want their education to be built on the solid foundation of Scripture." Emily said that would not have happened were it not for Point of View's bold consistency of shining light on public education. Your support for Point of View changes the future for children like Emily's. It leads people to start schools and ministries and businesses that change lives. How has the Truth Team impacted you? Please invest to bring truth to other families like Emily's. Support Truth today. Visit pointofview.net/team. or call 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151, and pointofview.net/team.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Preston Condra in studio with us. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Going to look at some of the objections, and I might just mention in this book, By Which We Are Saved, that in the very back there is an index of the objections, and I'd love to put some of these even on websites and things like that, so that eventually people can access them on their phones and that kind of thing. So nevertheless, that is what we'll get into in just a minute, some of those objections. But one of the links that we have here is a link to sufficientwordpublishing.com. There's a section for the books and the speaking. So certainly the books are available through you. And of course, anybody that would want to get a miniature version of the books in track form, you have that as well. But also you have an opportunity for people to schedule you or your wife for speaking. So talk about that.
We do. We're willing to speak, love to do that. That's one of the main things of what we want to do. Easy way to do that is you can email us at publisher at sufficientwordpublishing.com. You can go on the website, click on that. You can also go on our Facebook site. It's facebook.com/sufficient word. You can contact us there too. My wife would love to speak to your women's group or conference. I would love to speak in the churches, preach on a Sunday morning, or come speak to your leaders, whatever it may be. We'd be glad to do that. That's a real important part of what we're doing, I think.
And next to your picture there, of course, we have your link to your Twitter feed, your Facebook page, and then, of course, we have visit the website, and then we have information about the two books that are there as well. So all of it available at the website, pointofview.net, so you don't have to know how to spell all those names, although they're pretty easy to figure out. But again, it's at the website, pointofview.net. Let's get into a few objections, but also, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. You mentioned one of those objections, all roads lead to heaven. Now, you already helped us understand that from a physical point of view, that doesn't make any sense because all roads don't lead to the same place.
Right.
But a different analogy I hear, and many times hear this from my New Age or Buddhist friends. Well, there are different ways to the top of the mountain. If you're trying to get to the top of the mountain, you come up the north face, you can come up the east face, you can come up the west face, you can come up the south face. The metaphors that are used, the illustrations, don't work because Jesus in John 14:6 kind of sets that aside, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. When he says, I am the way, the truth, the life, and no one comes to the Father but by me, that limits him to the exclusive way. And in the original, Kerby, you know this too, the Greek word ha, the definite article, is there. So he is the way. Here's how I like to explain that. I'm just quoting Jesus.
Yeah.
This is what he said. I believe him. Yeah, absolutely I do. But he's the one who said it. I'm just telling you what he says. And really, frankly, we're fortunate that God did that. He is merciful. He's kind. He's good in providing a way at all. When Adam and Eve sinned, he would have been justified in just judging that sin and ending things right there. But he didn't. He's kind, and he offered the solution and even promised that, even as early as Genesis 3. So we're fortunate there is a way, and there is one way. And so I think people need to understand that. And that's part of the hope we have of the gospel, to proclaim that. Now, I think those who say there's more than one way, that also does, whether they mean to or not, does critique the uniqueness of Jesus. One, because he said that. Who am I going to believe here? Him or the person offering the counter argument? Well, I think Jesus he's right. I'm going to take his word. The other thing is, Jesus isn't just some ordinary guy. He is not just another prophet. He is unique from all the rest. He's different from Muhammad. Muhammad was just a man. Buddha, we don't even know if he actually really existed, right? We can go back through Joseph Smith. He is unique from Joseph Smith. He stands alone in his uniqueness, and his uniqueness is that he's the Old Testament prophesied Messiah. He was born of the Virgin by the Holy Spirit, just as the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John proclaim. he lived a sinless life. That's a crucial thing, because in a lot of these studies we see today, they're dismissing Jesus as sinless. Right. They're saying he is a sinner just like us, which is a point I want to get to in just a second. He died physically on the cross for our sins, was buried. That proved he died. On the third day, he rose from the dead according to the Scriptures, and he's coming back someday. And he's 100% man, 100% God. He's fully God, fully man, and he is the one and only way of salvation. Those are, when we talk about believing in Jesus, and when Paul's talking about Jesus here in 1 Corinthians 15, this is who he's talking about. And so Jesus is not just some ordinary person. If he's just a man like you and me, Kerby, he would need someone to die for his sins too, and therefore couldn't offer salvation for anybody, couldn't offer forgiveness. So that's why we say it's real important. Not only does Jesus say he's the only way of salvation, but it's all about him. When he says that, now we got to go and reflect on the person of Jesus.
Well said. And again, the argument that people sometimes make is Jesus was sinful, which is not what the Scriptures teach. It works the other way, because with our Muslim friends, if you read the Quran, and I have, and I've written books about that before, there's a place where actually Allah tells Muhammad that he has to deal with his sin. And so you have this situation, even in the Quran, where you have Jesus, this sinless prophet who was born of a virgin, who is the Messiah, and then you have Muhammad, who actually has to deal with his sin. So that's kind of intriguing. So that's another aspect of that as well. I do want to take some phone calls along the way. Would you like to take some phone calls?
Sure.
Of course, some people might have some objections or questions. You are certainly welcome to do so. And so let's take some calls, 1-800-351-1212. We may not get to all of them, but let's see if we can start out in Oklahoma. KJDR. Jim, what's your point of view today?
Yeah, just saying, I've been going to church for, 65, 70 years, something like that. I'm 75. But I just can't really, I find it hard to believe that pastors never speak about the Great Commission. Mm-hmm. If they do, it's just kind of in passing. Mm-hmm. If I hadn't gone to Bible school, I never would have got any instruction on, how to lead a person to Christ, or what to say to him, or, what you're looking for, what to pray for, anything like that. It's just amazing to me that we have really dropped the ball.
I think so. And frankly, again, I don't want to go to the Lifeway surveys too much, but when you ask even Southern Baptist pastors how many times do they share the gospel, maybe that's the problem. If it's misty in the pulpit, it's foggy in the pews, I sometimes say. Yeah. And Jim, if it's not happening from the pulpit, well, then why would you expect it to happen from the pews?
Right. That's true. And Jim, that's a good point. We do in a lot of churches hear less than we did. And I'm shocked at how little we hear on 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 4. I
know think at least at Easter, right?
First Corinthians 15 is preached on. Yeah, okay. I think this is something that I'm encouraging pastors tack this on the end of every sermon. Just if you're in Southern Baptist churches, a lot of times they do a public invitation. Why don't you just quote 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and 4? You want to present the gospel in just a short amount of time. That's how you do it. Put it in your bulletin. Put it on your website. Quote it all the time. I quote it every week. When I was a teaching elder at our church in Arkansas, I'd tack that on the end of every sermon. We didn't do a public invitation, but I presented the gospel every week. And so I would encourage that. But Jim, your point is well taken. And this is part of the reason we want to get these books in the churches. Now, let me say this too. I'm not trying to be too hard on the church or pastors, but I am one. But I think we can be more clear in the pulpit, because people don't know what we mean today by when we use shortcuts that we use to the gospel, like follow Jesus or give your heart to Jesus or whatever, call on the Lord. People don't know who we're talking about, first of all, and they don't know what we mean by that. They're not going to infer from that, hey, I want you to believe that you're a sinner, and if you'll believe that Jesus died for your sins, was buried, and rose again on the third day, you'll be saved. They're not going to infer that from follow Jesus. They're just not going to, because it's not the gospel.
Jim, I appreciate you getting us started in that direction.
Thank you, Jim.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We have to take a break, but when we come back, maybe we'll get into some other issues there as well. And when you think about that, 1 Corinthians 15, we've talked about this with Jeremiah Johnston. That is a very resurrection, cross-centric kind of passage. And one of the things he has pointed out, he's a teacher at Houston Baptist University, is that we really don't have messages that are all that resurrection-centric anymore, crucifixion-centric anymore. It's all about Jesus is your buddy, and Jesus is going to make your life better, and he has a wonderful plan for your life. I don't disagree with any of that, but there's a part that's missing there, and that's one of the reasons, again, I think why you wrote the book, isn't it?
That's right, yeah. Absolutely. We want the gospel presented thoroughly.
We have a lot more to cover. We'll try to do that as quickly as we can right after these important messages.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Father Joseph LaFleur served the Army Air Corps as chaplain during World War II. In 1941, LaFleur dashed about Clark Field in the Philippines amidst bombs and flying shrapnel, pulling wounded soldiers to safety. For such bravery, the Army Air Corps awarded Chaplain LaFleur the Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and Distinguished Service Cross. Later, while imprisoned by the Japanese for 3 years, he never stopped his ministry of care. He worked to meet the physical needs of his fellow prisoners, often bartering with guards for food. Once he confronted a fellow prisoner about stealing rations from other prisoners, even landing 2 holy punches to pacify the unruly and unrepentant soldier. In 1944, a U.S. submarine torpedoed LaFleur's prisoner transport ship. Rather than abandon ship or seek to escape Japanese gunfire and grenades lobbed in his direction, the chaplain worked to calm his men and to help them find an escape passage. Chaplain LaFleur died as he lived, in faithful service to his fellow man. Motivated by faith to care for their fellow man, chaplains in our nation's service routinely steady our servicemen and women before, during, and after battle. Military chaplains navigate the evils of war to bring good to our military. We honor Chaplain LaFleur and all chaplains for their dedication to the souls of our armed forces. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
After a few more minutes in studio with us today, Preston Condra. If you just joined us, talking about this book, By Which We Are Saved, Sharing the Gospel with Confidence. This is really the book kind of for Christians, and one that I would encourage you to use in your Sunday school class. But then you also have another one I'll just mention that is a little thinner, but it's I Have Some Good News, the Gospel Objections and Answers. This really is one I could hand to my non-Christian friends.
It really
is. It addresses many of those objections, and we've talked talked about all roads lead. What about works? I'm talking to a guy that's worked for years with all these different false religions, these counterfeit faiths. And every one of them to a person is a works-oriented salvation. And sadly, even evangelicals, when asked the question, you saw my article last week that came out here, when it said, do I have to do works to get into heaven? Even if they believe I'm saved, and even if they believe in Ephesians 2:8-9, somehow we still feel like we have to do work. So this works issue is big, not only outside the church, but even sometimes inside the church, isn't it?
It is, and I think, for Americans, it's hard for us to step away from climbing the ladder, making our own way, which, in a free market economy is a great thing.
Yeah.
When it comes to biblical salvation, though, it's by grace through faith. Kelly and I had a friend, which we talk about in the book, named Ruthie. She was in her 90s, and Kelly had been witnessing to her before even Kelly and I started dating. And so for 20 years, Kelly was sharing her faith with her. Well, when we got married, she'd tell Ruthie she married a Baptist minister, and Ruthie said, well, I want to talk, Kelly would present the gospel to her and go through it with her, and she would always say, Kerby, I just can't believe I don't have to do something. Mm-hmm. And Kelly would go through and say, no, it's by grace are you saved through faith. It's not of works. And even asking things like, do you really think you can impress God, that God's going to be impressed with something you can do, those kinds of things we'd go through. And she said, well, I want to talk to the minister. I want to hear it from him. And as if I have some more authority, Mm-hmm. And so we traveled up, and several times I shared with her too. And she said, well, I still just can't believe I don't have to do anything. Well,
she called us.
She called us 2 weeks before and said, "Yeah, I need you to come up." 2 weeks before she passed away, wow. She said, "I need you to come up." And it was, we didn't know for sure she was dying, and she told us she had written Jack Van Impe, and Jack Van Impe sent her the same thing we had told her. It's by grace through faith, and she said, "You know what? It is Jesus. It's only Him. He's taking care of it all," and I believe that. And so we were just thrilled. But yeah, that is a common.
Yes,
it's a common thing people believe, but at the end of the day, I like to ask people, do you really think you can stand before God someday, God Almighty, and knowing yourself as you do you think you can stand before Him someday and say, God, you owe me heaven?
Yeah.
You really think
great line.
You think you can do that? I can't.
Yeah.
I don't want what I deserve. I don't want what I deserve.
Yeah. And that's another one. People always say, give me what I deserve. Don't ever ask that question. Yeah. Don't ever say that.
That's
and
right.
And again, as I always say, there's nothing you can do to merit favor before a holy and righteous God.
That's right.
And usually the problem is people don't understand the holiness of God, right, and the extent of sin.
And their own sinfulness.
And even the wrath of God, mm-hmm, is a concept that hardly ever gets mentioned within the church.
You're right. And their own sinfulness. I mean, all that is minimized at best. But it's also an insult to the grace of God. I mean, He has extended mercy and grace when He didn't have to. Grace is Him extending a gift that we don't deserve. And mercy is Him not giving us what we do deserve. He is kind and gracious, but He's also just, Kerby. He is going to do what He said He's going to do. I mean, we talk about corruption. You do a good job on Point of View of really showing us where corruption is that we need to be aware of in government, and it's important in American society. God's not like a judge on a bench. He here. If a judge here let off a criminal, didn't give the criminal what the law says, we would call him corrupt. If God says one thing, but when we get up there, He says, nah, I didn't really mean that. Come on in.
Yeah.
Then that's corrupt. God's not corrupt.
That's very well said. Your wife co-authored this book with you, so I got to give her some props, because one of the sections that made me laugh out loud is the question that we get oftentimes about people in other countries, but she phrased it different. What about the people in Bongo Bongo? I love that. I may start using that because, so many times when I've shared my faith, more on a college campus, because I don't do that much now other than on radio occasionally, but you get somebody that would say, what about the pagans in Africa? And I always come back and say, well, I think there are probably now more Christians in Africa than there are in America. So there are people in Africa wondering about the pagans in America. So what about you? And I bring them back back to that. But you get these people
That's
wondering
right.
about,
That's
what
a good
about
answer.
those poor people in Bongo? Can you respond to that?
Right.
for a minute?
I think it's the same way, Kirby, and just what you said echoes it. I mean, most of these countries, there have been missionaries there for a lot of time. And you go back in ancient history,
Yes.
the Apostle Paul, the scriptures say the apostles went to all the world.
Yeah.
So the gospel has gotten out to all the world. And we're not giving enough credit to ancient man either. I think they're far more intelligent than we give them credit for. And so the gospel's been out for a couple thousand years now. And so I don't think it, and plus it's hypothetical. We haven't produced these people yet.
And again,
it's an evasion. It's an evasion of.
And another answer is if somebody's really seeking, think of the Ethiopian eunuch in the book of Acts.
Right.
Okay. God sends Philip, right? You know, I mean, so you have that. And of course, we have stories about the peace child and so many other things that kind of illustrate that as well. But the book is full of answers to those kinds of objections, and also just a very clear presentation of the gospel. And I only took one call this hour, but I'll take some more in the next hour if some people want to call in and make their comments about evangelism or what their church is or isn't doing. But I think his point was a good one, and that's why I wanted to use that before I let you go, and that is a lot of churches just aren't doing the teaching. Yeah. So if, indeed, people want more information, they can go to pointofview.net, click on your picture. We have then a link to your Facebook page, to the Twitter account. They can click on the button that says visit the web page, or they can go directly to sufficientwordpublishing.com, but you don't have to even spell all that out because we've got the link there. That's where they can get the books. That's where they can find out more about speaking. But talk about how someone that is in positions of leadership. So right now we're talking to pastors, Bible fellowship leaders, Sunday school leaders, small group leaders. How could they use books like this in their teaching so that they could really begin to have an evangelism explosion? How could that take place?
I'd recommend, first of all, like we talked about earlier, a sermon series, By Which We Are Saved sermon series. I think you have more people coming to church on a Sunday than you do in Sunday school class, and I would couple it with Sunday school or small group study. And I'd love to come kick that off for you or help train your leaders, whatever we can do to get this in the hands of folks. And in a church, the most powerful communication point is the pulpit. And it's still one of the most powerful communication points in the world, is the local church pulpits of America. And I think if we can get our churches to be regularly showing 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 4, we're going to make a difference in the lives of believers and non-believers. And we're going to help believers be effective in sharing their faith.
Well, I hope that you get into a church where maybe they have some good video production, because I would love for you and Kelly to do some of that, so that you maybe even provide a promotional DVD or something like that for people to begin to understand a little bit more about evangelism. There is incredible need. We're not sharing our faith. It's time to turn this around, and that's one of the reasons why you wrote those books, and that's one of the reasons why you came down from Arkansas today to join us in studio.
That's right, and they're also available on Amazon, by the way.
Yeah, well, we have that link there as well.
Okay.
So, Preston, I'm going to meet your wife, Kelly, maybe next time.
Yes,
but we'll get you in studio again, and thank you for sharing your vision about evangelism, and thank you for writing these books.
Thank you, Kirby. Thank you for having me on.
We're going to take a break. We have a lot more to cover, but again, if you'd like some more information, sufficientwordpublishing.com. And of course, it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. Got a lot more to cover. We'll do that right after this.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net, or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151,
or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221.
Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. This hour, we're going to spend a little bit of time in the first half hour talking to our good friend Penny Nance. She is the CEO and president of Concerned Women for America. What a great organization. 500,000 participating CWA members across the country, 400 prayer action chapters, and so many other ways in which you can be involved with this organization. Let me encourage you, if you're not a member of Concerned Women for America, to do so. She was named as one of the most powerful pro-life female voices by Christian Post, a graduate of Liberty University, and always an individual that we count on to understand some of these important issues before us. And so, Penny Nance, welcome back to Point of View.
Well, thank you for having me, and it's a joy to be here with you.
Let's, if we can, talk about one of these pieces of legislation that I wanted to focus on, and that is President Trump the other day signed an anti-sex trafficking bill, and I have in front of me and have posted for our listeners your comments about that, because this is something that didn't get a lot of press. It's something that I am so grateful that took place, but give us some of the background. For some of our listeners, they may not be even aware that he signed the bill and even what the issue is. Can you explain that?
You know, Kerby, I'm so glad we're getting an opportunity to discuss this. I mean, honestly, this is the biggest win we have had on the issue of sex trafficking in 15 years. The piece of legislation that mattered the most before this one was the Trafficking in Persons Act. It set up the tip office at the State Department and really set the boundaries and changed the view of law enforcement of sex trafficking victims from just simply, quote unquote, prostitutes to actually seeing them as the victims that they are. And that was, and really kind of set up the structure to deal with them once that they're discovered. Before that, they were just jailed and treated as prostitutes. There was no services for them. There was no visa for them. There was, really a whole range of services it unlocked. But after that, because of a hole in the Communications Decency Act, just a loophole, people like Backpage, these companies that were selling, essentially selling little children and women and for purposes of sex and exploitation over the internet, were getting a pass. And Congress never intended there to be that loophole utilized in that way. And we had tried to close the loophole for a number of years. And we always came up against people like Google and Silicon Valley and lost. Groups like ours function, and our strength is based on our grassroots. It's not based on money. And they were always able to essentially overpower us because of their power of the purse. And so thankfully, working together with Ann Wagner, who's the congresswoman from Missouri, who was the sponsor of this legislation and was so brave. It was really a David and Goliath battle. And people leading the charge was people like Donna Rice Hughes with Enough is Enough. And, of course, CWA was coming alongside with others. And so we were able, because of where we are in this country, because of the Me Too movement, because that President Trump was in support of this legislation, we won. We were actually able to close the loophole. And then we saw immediately, before the president had even actually signed the bill into law, there was about a week lag between the time that Congress passed the bill and it made it to the president's desk, we saw I think it was about 9 different websites closed down, including Backpage, seized by the federal government, but there was others. And it is I just can't tell you, Ann Wagner came and spoke to my group last week, and we were crying. I mean, it was really such a powerful moment, as such a giant leap forward in our fight to abolish sex trafficking. This had to happen. And so now we actually have the tools to hold people accountable through criminal liability and through victims have the right to sue. We really can really hold people accountable, and there's liabilities for companies who are aiding and abetting sex traffickers.
Let me just again say that we, of course, have listeners in Missouri. As a matter of fact, I see one of our callers here wants to join us, maybe will in this half hour later, from Missouri. But Ann Wagner from Missouri, and for those of you in Missouri, you might send a note to her and thank her. And Ann Wagner is one of our point of view heroes, of course, always. Penny Nance is one of our point of view heroes. But I think you made a point that I want to come back for just a minute, because in your comments, you talked about the fact that the president was willing to stand up to Silicon Valley. The previous president owed, I think, some of his support to those organizations. And over these last few weeks, Penny, we've been talking about the kind of the big tech companies and how they oftentimes aren't necessarily sympathetic to privacy issues, censorship issues, or something else.
Right.
Here's a good example here where what's called FOSTA, which stands for, again, Allowing States to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, was one where he had to, in a sense, stand up against Silicon Valley. And I hope that more of that takes place in the future, don't you?
Well, that's right. I mean, there is rarely a big piece of legislation, something that really makes an amazing amount of difference, in which you're not going to have people to push back on you, right? There's always a point and counterpoint, and often it's two industries fighting against each other in Washington. And that's often just about money and market share. And so, that's not something CWA is interested in. This is about fighting for the rights of the oppressed and human rights. But you saw the memo that got exposed from Facebook, in which they said, all we care about, even if people die, is for there to be more market share, for there to be more people in our community, right? That's all that they and that is a really ugly way to say that, but it exposed really sort of the underlying view. And the other thing is, these companies always are in self-protection mode. They never want to have any exposure. Their lawyers are always saying, doing everything to limit their liability. Well, sometimes they need to be held liable. We believe in the free market, and we are capitalists at CWA. But there comes a line that has to be drawn, in which you knowingly are aiding and abetting the use and abuse of another human being. I'm sorry, you deserve what happens to you in that case. And so we really did have pushback from Silicon Valley, from big media, and the president chose to side with victims. And really, I think in the last administration, you said it, I think they were quite beholden to Silicon Valley. A lot of their support was coming from there. And this president chose rightly and chose to be on the side of the oppressed.
Well, let's see if we can take a break. And, of course, you might remember the last time we had Penny Nance on, we talked about a piece that she had in USA Today, kind of got into the Me Too issue, but in particular saying, Anita Hill's not exactly the best example of trying to address that issue. And so we'll get into that. Also talk about just some of the good work that Concerned Women for America is doing, get into some of the pro-life issues and some of the other legislation they're following. So we'll take a break, and we'll continue for a few more minutes with Penny Nance. By the way, if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, we certainly will see if a few of those could be put on the air while she's with us, or else we'll have you join us in that last half hour of an open line. Give us a call, 1-800-351-1212.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
A question Johnny Erickson Tata has been asking over the years is, when is it right to die? That is the title of her book and has recently been updated. She understands this issue for many reasons. One of the most significant is the fact that she has spent more than 50 years in her wheelchair. She was on my radio program recently to talk about the latest edition of her book. She is concerned that society is more and more willing to accept the idea that a person has a right to die. I even talked about the pressure many with disabilities face when there is a subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, comments that imply they have a duty to die. I also asked Johnny to remind our audience that after her accident 50 years ago, she wanted to die. A diving accident as a teenager, she said, left her permanently paralyzed and in deadly despair. She even tried, with no success, to try to break her neck higher so she would die. She understands why so many would want to end their lives, but also believes we can provide hope and comfort to those who are convinced suicide is the only answer. In a related article she wrote for Christianity Today, she talked about speaking to a high school class about euthanasia and suicide. One young man described how demoralized his mother was in caring for his sister, who was developmentally delayed. He said society should do something. Johnny asked him, "How have you helped alleviate the burden?" She went on to explain that his mother wouldn't be so demoralized if he helped. The student immediately realized he might be part of the answer. The point she was making is that suicide and euthanasia are everyone's responsibility. This is especially true in a world where more and more states are willing to legalize euthanasia and put to death people who are discouraged and depressed and ready to die. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Penny Nance with us for a few more minutes. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Might take a call while she's here. Certainly we'll take some calls in the open line that will be taking place after she leaves. But again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to see her comments about the anti-sex trafficking bill, we have those available on our website. And of course, we have a link to Concerned Women for America as well. Penny, for just a minute, let's, if we can, talk about the other aspect of this, sexual trafficking, sexual harassment. And those really, unfortunately, come together so often because in this highly sexualized culture, whether we're talking with Donna Rice Hughes or Noel Boucher of Pure Hope or June Hunt, where we've done some of these programs on sexual trafficking, this is a problem. And I recognize that while we can address this issue of sexual trafficking, we still have the First Amendment rights to promote pornography and the rest. But this whole Me Too movement, last time we had you on, where you were pointing out the fact that you don't want to use people like Anita Hill or people that were defending former President Bill Clinton, saying, well, they all do it, as the figureheads of the individuals that need to begin to address this very significant and important problem of sexual harassment.
Yeah, I think what we were discussing at the time is, I think there's a tendency to want to politicize this issue, and that's a mistake because this isn't about politics. It's about the heart, and it's about the brokenness and sinfulness of man. And as much as I would like to think that only liberals do bad things, that is not the case. No. And I can, I've specifically called out Republicans who were named, who it became clear had been guilty of sexual impropriety, And I have said, very clearly, and will continue to say, that the American people should not be picking up the bill for people who had to pay for sexual misconduct. The members of Congress who did that should have to pay out of their own pockets. And what's more, the American people should know who they are so their constituents have all the information when they go to the voting booth and can make wise decisions about who they want to represent them. When it's hidden and when it's kept undercover, not only are we paying as a taxpayer to cover up their sin, we also can't make a wise decision on whether or not we should reelect them. So I've talked, very openly about that. I've been very clear with the House and Senate leadership on that point, and we're not going to let that go. We feel very strongly. The issue of Anita Hill was in regard to the fact that Hollywood, I believe, has an opportunity. They have an opportunity to really clean up their own industry. And, the stories that have come out have been horrific, but not just Hollywood, certainly media, business, government. But Hollywood in particular, who, profits often off of exploitation, had, not surprisingly, some real issues within their own ranks and within their own industry. But instead of taking it head on, owning what they've done, they've instead chosen to politicize it by doing their own little commission, and they put Anita Hill in charge of it. Anita Hill is not someone that we all can relate to. There's reams of lists of women who would be fantastic for this job.
Yes.
That are, neither Republican or Democrat, that have people that we both can respect, we all respect. But Anita Hill, let's remember, is an icon for the left because of the things that she said about Justice Thomas and things that have largely been, frankly, discredited. And so, I was just expressing disappointment that once again, when they had an opportunity to really own this, to really make a difference, they chose to rely on politics again.
Let's, if we can, talk about Concerned Women for America, and one of the ways to come into that is just last week we had a round table of guests. All of them were female, all running for office, all won their primaries and running for the general election. And I said, I'd like each one of you to address an issue that I know people like Penny Nance and others have talked about, and that is the push from the liberal agenda that says, well, if you're a woman, you have to assume and you have to accept and even endorse the so-called women's agenda, which means women's reproductive rights, pay equity, support of Planned Parenthood. And of course, to a person, none of them did. But that's one of the reasons Concerned Women for America exists, to say, there is a very large women's organization, and it's not National Organization of Women, it's Concerned Women for America. Speak to that, if you might.
Well, that's right. We were, founded in 1979 by Dr. Beverly LaHaye as, frankly, the counterpoint to the left hard-leaning feminism at the time. And so that's not gone away. It's just reconstituted as the Women's March. And we are, it is essential that as 51% of the population, we push back on the notion that we're monolithic. Millions of women don't think exactly the same on every issue. And there's such a large number, as you pointed out, of women around this country who strongly are, have strong faith and love their families and believe in the sanctity of human life and religious freedom. And, every day are working so hard to protect our nation and protect their family. And there's so much more in line are in line with Concerned Women for America, and not with the Women's March, who believes in abortion on demand, any number, anytime, all paid for by the taxpayer, and even gone as far as to we were just talking about the sex trafficking bill, to stand up on behalf of Backpage and to embrace legalization of prostitution. The vast majority of women are not in line with them. So it is really important that we stand as the counterpoint to that in media, in the state legislatures, on Capitol Hill, and we're doing that every day. We're doing it very thoughtfully and strategically. Our numbers are growing. This next generation of conservative women are coming to the forefront. We have 40 college chapters now and growing called Young Women for America. And we believe that what we're doing now is just as important, if not more important, than in the past. And we need all your listeners to come join what we're doing.
Well, again, let me just mention again, 400 prayer action chapters, 40 Young Women for America chapters, and all the rest. Now, as people go to concernwomen.org, one of the things they'll see right off the bat, and I thought I'd mention this is our Esther moment. Now is the time to stand together and leverage this God-given influence. And it's a picture of President Donald Trump, and sitting to his right is Penny Nance. And this is an opportunity for you to speak to the president. And those opportunities haven't always existed in the past, have they?
Well, that's right. I mean, we are so grateful to, really be the voice of influence, the voice for conservative women. God has given us this moment, and we understand that, and we welcome it, and we will not in any way shirk from our duty to speak truth to power, to stand beside the president and urge him on the issue of life, protection of Israel. I mean, those are issues that I and others have directly advocated to the president and taught people within his administration about. And we embrace it, but we're stronger together. And we really, when you're talking about that picture, to me, when I look at that picture, I'm sitting there, but when I look at that picture, I recognize that it's not me sitting there. I'm sitting there as a placeholder for all of our members, all the conservative pro-life women around this country who don't have the opportunity to speak directly to the president. We are simply their voice. And so, again, we urge people to join together, and we have gone from being an organization in Washington to being an institution. Concerned Women for America has put a stake in the ground for the last 40 years, and we are going nowhere. We are here on behalf of conservative women, and we get to be their voice of influence.
Again, there's a number of links there for her Twitter account, Facebook account, as well as a link to concernwomen.org. We've posted, again, a link on our website, pointofview.net, also this article about the anti-sex trafficking bill, and we encourage you to find out more, become a member, and get involved. And Penny Nance, always great to have you on the program. Let's do it again soon.
Thank you, Kerby. God bless. Bye-bye.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll take some of those phone calls. Some of you in this last half hour will have an open line, so giving you that opportunity to join in. I have a couple of things to say. Our good friend Robert Knight had a comment about Chick-fil-A, so I thought I'd get into that. My commentary today is about the right to die, so all sorts of issues to address, but also an open line. Love to get your comments. We talked about evangelism last hour. We've talked about sex trafficking. We've talked about the sexualized culture. All sorts of topics are fair game, and if you'd like to join our conversation, make a comment or ask a question, we certainly welcome those. 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to know more about anything we've been talking about, it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. Hope you'll go and get those articles. And if you might, click on that button that says donate. We would appreciate your financial support. We'll be back with your phone calls right after this.
Does Point of View make any difference? I think Dr. Eric Walsh would say it does. Dr. Walsh was fired from his job as District Health Director for the state of Georgia, not because of anything he did or failed to do on the job, but because of sermons he preached in his local church. What does that have to do with Point of View? Jeremy Dyes of First Liberty represented Dr. Walsh, and in February, the state of Georgia paid a large settlement for their religious discrimination. And Jeremy Dyes became an attorney specializing in defending religious liberty, greatly because of what he learned listening to Point of View radio as a child. That is the kind of difference you make when you support the Truth Team, but we can't make that difference without your help. Become a partner today in this important mission of speaking truth in love. Join the Truth Team at pointofview.net/team. Choose your giving level, stretch a bit, and please do it today. Or call 800-347-5151. pointofview.net/team. Or 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Just a program note, next week we will certainly be focusing on a lot of issues, but tomorrow let me focus on at least what we'll be talking about, and that is John Smirik will be with us, and we'll look at the battle and the military action in Syria and the civil war and how to think about that from a just war perspective. We'll also have Ray Moore on with a group that has been talking about the need for us to get our kids out of the public schools, and we'll be talking with him. And so I hope that you will join us for those conversations. And in between, we'll be getting into some other issues in the news. Of course, we have a Millennial Roundtable, and Emily Boltz, who is with World Magazine, will be joining us, and Randy Frazee will be with us later in the week. And if I get time today, I also want to read a piece from Jerry Newcomb, which we'll talk about more on Thursday. But let's take some phone calls first. In Missouri, KTTK, Scott, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yeah, thank you, Kerby. I was just wondering, my question is, why do you think it's so widely considered inappropriate to do an invitation or to present the gospel at a funeral? I've seen preachers do present the gospel, but then not go that step and do the invitation. And that always concerns me, because the moment they walk out of there, the devil's going to tell them, immediately begin to harden up their heart again. The heart's been softened. And I lost my 17-year-old daughter to lung cancer, and there were many people saved at her funeral. And I take comfort in that. I don't think I'm going to be concerned. I want to meet those people when I get to heaven, and I don't think inappropriate is going to come up 10,000 years from now. Thanks, Kerby.
I think it's a good point. First of all, I would completely sign off on the fact that one of the most effective venues for evangelism is funerals. It's sad to say. I mean, you would wish more people would spend some time thinking about their eternal destiny, but they don't. But there is something about a funeral that really does focus people's attention. A number of years ago, I had a pastor tell me, just in passing, that he says, I really hate doing weddings, but I love doing funerals. And it just completely caught me off guard. It's kind of like, what? I mean, I think you'd be just the opposite. I love doing weddings because, it's the beginning of a couple funerals where there's obviously a lot of sadness. And he didn't mean that he didn't want to do them, but he meant that when there is a wedding, all the eyes are on the bride, and he is almost like a secondary issue. As a matter of fact, you can probably only mention on one hand the number of let's talk weddings first. Weddings that you've been at where you can even remember anything that the pastor said, because you're focused on the couple and the pastor, unless they make a really big mistake or say something that was really insightful. It's pretty routine. Whereas he says in a funeral, just the opposite. All the eyes are on him the whole time, and people are well aware of their eternal destiny, and there's just a real opportunity to share the gospel. So, again, exactly what Scott was saying. The point is that Scott's making, and I'll, again, leave that to pastors to figure out what is appropriate and what isn't appropriate. To have someone step forward, those kinds of calling for a decision, that can be done in different ways, raising your hand or standing or whatever that doesn't look disruptive. But I appreciate what Scott says. Sometimes people say inappropriate, or it wouldn't be in good company, it wouldn't be seen as gracious, might not be good manners. Yeah, in light of eternity, manners inappropriate, some of those might not necessarily be the case. So again, I think you have to take some of those funerals on a case-by-case basis, but what an opportunity at a funeral to share the gospel. And of course, please take other opportunities to share the gospel as well. And that's one of the reasons we had Preston Condra in the first hour today. I would, again, recommend some of his books, By Which We Are Saved, and I have some good news, a couple of books that are great resources for you. And if you didn't have a chance to hear that interview, feel free to go to our website, pointofview.net, and you can actually watch the program because he was in studio, or listen to the program. And so some great resources there available at our website, pointofview.net. I have a commentary coming out next week on Chick-fil-A, and I wasn't going to say much about it, but our good friend Robert Knight has done a piece that appeared in the Washington Times today, in which he reminds us that even though Chick-fil-A has become incredibly successful in New York City, it has now opened the largest restaurant in their chain, 12,000 square feet. And as he even points out, one of these stores reportedly sells a chicken sandwich every 6 seconds. Not everybody in New York has been quite so enthusiastic, and so he talks about the fact that, quote, and I'm quoting from Robert Knight, "We know the ruling elites in New York are unsettled by Chick-fil-A's enormous success because New Yorker Magazine, their flagship of cool, has done a hit job." He says, "Keep in mind, this is not your father's New Yorker, which was chock full of compelling reading and cartoons you'd put on the refrigerator." He says, "You may already have heard about the article that appeared on April 13th in the New Yorker entitled," here's the title of it, "Chick-fil-A's Creepy Infiltration of New York City." He says its urban arrogance and contempt for Christianity ticked off not a few people, which is obviously intentional. He says that was done in part to juice up readership. And he says the New Yorker tweeted that Chick-fil-A's arrival in New York feels like an infiltration in no small part because of its pervasive Christian traditionalism. And so he talks a little bit about some of that. And he said I was first actually brought attention to this from a blogger by the name of Iowa Hawk. I'm going to have to get to know more about him, who said, "Once again, if you're frightened by what Trump says about immigrants, you should see what the New Yorker says about people from their own country." And he complains that the newest store, which is, by the way, 3 stories, is one that they feel has an ulterior motive, and that is that it's trying to glorify God. Because, after all, that is the mission statement of Chick-fil-A. And he then takes on, that is the writer of The New Yorker, takes on the Chick-fil-A cows, which have deliberately misspelled "eat more chicken," and said it's impossible to overstate the cows. If the restaurant is a megachurch, the cows are its ultimate evangelists. And it goes on to some of the comments that are made about that as well, including one where the writer of The New Yorker is disturbed, which I think is kind of interesting, about the fact that these cows are actually encouraging them to eat another animal rather than the cows. And I love what, again, Robert Knight says, "I don't think many people go into that deep into the liberal whirly pit. If they did, they'd have to run Charlie the Tune out of supermarkets for urging customers to eat Charlie's own canned finny friends." And so, if nothing else, what we're seeing is that Chick-fil-A has created kind of a stir. And my commentary next week, of course, reminds us that maybe one of the reasons is because Chick-fil-A has become so successful. It will, in a few years, become the 3rd largest fast food chain behind McDonald's and Starbucks, with a $9 billion worth of revenue last year. And it's possible that the reason it has a target on its back is either due to the mission statement, which is to glorify God, or the 2012 interview with CEO Dan Cathy about traditional marriage and LGBT issues. Because, as I point out, secularists don't like Christian companies. Gay rights activists don't like companies that don't support their homosexual agenda. But, of course, as I also point out in my commentary for next week, there are other companies and organizations that have the same views and values as Chick-fil-A, but they don't seem to be targeted as much as this chicken sandwich company. Many of these other groups are more politically involved. They support various groups. They lobby for legislation. They support various candidates. But nevertheless, Chick-fil-A seems to always have a target on its back, and maybe some of that has to do with the fact that because Chick-fil-A has become so successful, now they have billboards and posters everywhere. And maybe to some New Yorkers, that feels like, what did they call it? An infiltration. So I end by just saying, people in New York, our New Yorker friends, maybe they just need to be a little bit like the rest of the country. Because, for quite some time, many of us have been bombarded by ads about products and services by companies with values that are often very hostile to Christian beliefs. So maybe they could learn something from us and adopt the philosophy of live and let live. Anyway, Chick-fil-A still causing a stir in New York City, but doing quite well, thank you. And one of the things that Robert Knight says is maybe the whole Chick-fil-A ethos will catch a fire, and maybe eventually we'll even have taxi drivers saying, "My pleasure," with a slightly southern accent. Let's take a break, and if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Got a lot more to cover, and we will do that right after these messages. But if you'd like to find out a little bit more about some of the individuals we've interviewed today, some of the books, some of the resources, some of the articles, all available, as always, on our website, pointofview.net. My encouragement especially is with that Penny Nance article, hit that share button. Put it on your Facebook page and educate some people about how we're going after sex trafficking. We'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. Father Joseph LaFleur served the Army Air Corps as chaplain during World War II. In 1941, LaFleur dashed about Clark Field in the Philippines amidst bombs and flying shrapnel, pulling wounded soldiers to safety. For such bravery, the Army Air Corps awarded Chaplain LaFleur the Purple Heart, Bronze Star, and Distinguished Service Cross. Later, while imprisoned by the Japanese for 3 years, he never stopped his ministry of care. He worked to meet the physical needs of his fellow prisoners, often bartering with guards for food. Once he confronted a fellow prisoner about stealing rations from other prisoners, even landing 2 holy punches to pacify the unruly and unrepentant soldier. In 1944, a U.S. submarine torpedoed LaFleur's prisoner transport ship. Rather than abandon ship or seek to escape Japanese gunfire and grenades lobbed in his direction, the chaplain worked to calm his men and to help them find an escape passage. Chaplain LaFleur died as he lived, in faithful service to his fellow man. Motivated by faith to care for their fellow man, chaplains in our nation's service routinely steady our servicemen and women before, during, and after battle. Military chaplains navigate the evils of war to bring good to our military. We honor Chaplain LaFleur and all chaplains for their dedication to the souls of our armed forces. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Okay, for a few more minutes, let me just mention tomorrow we have John Smirik on. We're going to talk about Syria, the civil war there, but most importantly, how to think about a military engagement and just war. We don't do this too often, but when there has been a military action, let's talk about what that means and how to address that issue. And then we're going to have Ray Moore with us, and he is the head of Frontline Ministries, used to be called Exodus Mandate. As a matter of fact, you can still go to the website, exodusmandate.org. We'll talk about what's going on in the public schools. Did a little bit of that with Lance Zumi a few weeks ago, but he'll be in with us to talk about that. So I appreciate you joining us tomorrow for those conversations. Of course, don't forget, we have our Millennial Roundtable. We will also be talking with Jerry Newcomb on Thursday. Of course, we have our Friday weekend edition as well. My commentary today is called Right to Die, and it's based upon this new book, in some respects, a revised book by Joni Eareckson Tada. Yes, she had a book that came out many years ago, but she's completely updated it, and it's, in a sense, almost a new book, where she has been asking this very important question: when is it right to die? And she understands this because, as we pointed out when she did the short interview with us, that she spent more than 50 years in her wheelchair and really has talked about the concern about the fact that we have a society that is more and more willing to accept the idea that a person has a right to die. I even interjected, and I talk about this in my book, moral ethics and Christian ethics in plain language, that some, even with disabilities, feel the pressure that they have a duty to die. And of course, she reminded us of the fact that 50 years ago, when she broke her neck in a diving accident, she found herself permanently paralyzed in deadly despair and tried, with no success, to try to break her neck so she would die. And she understands only so well the pressure that is being put on people with disabilities or the people that are maybe even depressed, the desire to die. And so this is one of the issues, because she is pointing out how suicide and euthanasia are everyone's responsibility. So if you haven't had a chance to read my commentary, it is available at our website, pointofview.net, and there's an opportunity for you to sign up to receive my commentary. We put it in your inbox every day, Monday through Friday. Penedexter's commentary comes out on Saturday, so those are some resources we also want to put in your box. Sometimes we cover topics that we've addressed on the air, sometimes new topics, but it gives you some facts, figures, and statistics that you can use and maybe pass on to your friends as well. On Thursday, we're going to have Jerry Newcomb with us, and we'll be talking about his commentary on Confessions of a Christian Constitutionalist. But I thought I'd give you a little bit of a preview, because his piece came out in Front Page Magazine. And when he did this, interestingly enough, he had written a previous column about fake news. And so immediately somebody sent a note saying, well, what is really fake news is the fact that you're propagating fake news by saying the Bible had anything to do with the founding of America, and was arguing that basically the Constitution is a product of the Enlightenment. As we'll talk about more, when you look at the founding fathers, look at first of those who founded this country, he takes us back in the column to the Mayflower Compact, which was written in 1620. Which was actually written on the Mayflower before they actually disembarked. It's done in the name of God. He talks about the Puritan covenants. One of the things that people fail to realize is that the Puritans had this, what are called the body of liberties, and many of those liberties which were provided to the Puritans are things which ended up in our Constitution. So pilgrims as well as Puritans. And then we can also talk about the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut in 1639, which stated that their colony was for the liberty and purity of the gospel of the Lord Jesus. And many people believe that the first real complete constitution were the Fundamental Orders, and that's to this day why Connecticut calls itself the Constitution State. So then we move from the founders of this country then to the framers of our Constitution. And you can see that the Constitution itself was completed in the year of our Lord. There are all sorts of constitutional provisions, many of which came from some of these previous documents, the body of liberties by the Puritans and the fundamental orders of the Constitution that are found in Connecticut. And, of course, it also quotes from the Declaration, which 4 different times actually mentions God either explicitly or implicitly. And if you don't believe so, read the Constitution and the Declaration for yourself, and you'll see that as well. But then finally he asks, I think, a fundamental question. Was all this the product of men of the Enlightenment? And he quotes from Michael Novak, who's been on this program with us before, and I met him years ago when I was at Georgetown University, because Michael Novak has made a very good point. and that is the Enlightenment was not monolithic. There were two types of Enlightenment thinkers. There were those that were in kind of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and that would be Montesquieu, that would be Locke, that would be Blackstone, and then there are others that were not. That would be like Hume or Voltaire. But if you look at the founders of our country, and especially the framers of our Constitution, my major professor at Georgetown University took American political theory from him and others, actually spent a fair amount of time with other professors really documenting where these quotes come from, because where did these ideas that ended up in the Constitution come from? Because some of them seem like they spring out of thin air. Well, they found that the document most often quoted was the Bible, 33% of the time. The next most quoted author was Baron Montesquieu in his Spirit of the Laws. Montesquieu said that we shall see that we owe to Christianity in government a certain political law, and in war a certain law of nations, benefits with human nature can never sufficiently acknowledge. One of the other individuals quoted was Blackstone, who is often quoted by the Supreme Court and said the laws of nature were written by God and supplemented by the Holy Scriptures. And then, of course, John Locke. Matter of fact, it's quite clear that Thomas Jefferson said that Locke was very influential in his writing of the Declaration, and John Locke penned that the Bible is one of the greatest blessings bestowed on God on the children of men. And so you can see that that is certainly an aspect as well. And then through this piece, which we'll talk about more on Thursday with Jerry Newcomb, he gives us quotes from first George Washington, our first president, refers to Jesus as the divine author of our blessed religion. He then quotes from the second president, John Adams, who calls a decent respect for Christianity among the best recommendations for public service. Then quotes from Thomas Jefferson, our third president, who talks about Jesus as the reason that we have religious freedom and is the holy author of our religion. And then quotes also from James Madison, who is really the architect of the Constitution, who said before any man can be considered as a member of civil society, he must be considered as a subject of the governor of the universe, that is, a governor of God. And I think you can see pretty clearly that you'd have to almost try to go out of your way to ignore the comments by so many of the founders of our country, the framers of our Constitution, and our first presidents, to say that none of that had to do with the Bible, because if anything, that's exactly what you would see. And as I've said on this program many times before, I think any fair-minded person would have to say that Christianity was very instrumental in the founding of this republic. But the sad reality is some people reject that, but even more so, even if they accept that, they somehow now today believe that even though Christianity was important in the founding of this republic, it's not important in the maintenance of this republic. Yes, it is, and that's why we do what we do here at Point of View. We talk about faith, family, and freedom, and that's why we encourage you to tune in every single day. I want to thank Andrew and Stephen for their help behind the scenes. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. or call us 800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.